Hello everyone. If one day you go to the Cathedral of Aachen, Germany, you will see a spectacular octagonal chapel called the Palatine Chapel. Palatine means that it belongs or belonged to a palace. It mixes Roman and Byzantine architecture, with the dome rising 100 feet, 31 meters, and a rich decoration of colorful mosaics, marble columns, and intricate gold work. On the upper level of the chapel, there's a simple but imposing marble seat that remains, overlooking the altar below and the crowds that gathered in the chapel. The throne of an emperor, placed up there to symbolize his authority as both a secular political ruler and a protector of the Christian faith. This emperor was Charlemagne. The chapel is the best preserved, the last remaining element of a large palace that has mostly disappeared. And this is the story we are going to explore tonight. This will take us back once again to the Middle Ages, but the early Middle Ages, the 8th and 9th centuries. That is to say, medieval times before stone castles and cathedrals. A time when people often lived with remains of Roman buildings around them. A time when Christianity had not yet replaced pagan cults on the northern and eastern fringes of Europe. A time when large cities had disappeared and most people lived in hamlets or villages. And a time of young kingdoms created by the peoples that had overwhelmed the Western Roman Empire. None of the states of the countries of contemporary Europe existed yet, and frontiers were imprecise and could change fast. And finally, also a time of technical and economic backwardness for Western Europe. The days of Roman prosperity, of safety, architecture, and all sorts of cultural refinements were long gone. It was a world that would probably feel very wild, decadent, dangerous, and even destitute to us, but that would turn out to be an important matrix of Europe, of its cultures, its kingdoms, and its rebuilding along the Middle Ages. So before we begin our journey to the past, please make yourself comfortable, take a deep breath, let the tension go in your shoulders and your limbs, and off we go. The backdrop of our story tonight is Western Europe in the 8th and 9th centuries. But to understand the rise and relevance of Charlemagne, we need to know what this world he lived in was like. As I told you, the first centuries of the Middle Ages, these were a period of transition and transformation in Europe. Transformation because the legacy of the Roman Empire kept fading. New powers were rising on its ashes, and the foundations of what would come next, medieval society, economy, and politics, these foundations were being laid. Of course, after the dislocation of the Roman Empire, all centralized authority had disappeared, and Western Europe had become a patchwork of new kingdoms, often ruled by Germanic tribal kings, the sovereigns of these peoples that had settled within and sometimes fought against the Roman Empire. Of these new political forces, the most significant at the time was the Frankish Kingdom. It was a state that expanded from the 5th century and outlived many of its rivals. Its historical core territory, its heartland, was inside the frontiers of the former Western Roman Empire, near the Rhine and the Meuse rivers, in what is now the northeast of France, the west of Germany and Belgium. The Franks were a group of Germanic peoples that had crossed the frontier of the Roman Empire and settled inside, which the empire could not resist in its last century. So instead, it tried to accommodate them, hiring groups of Franks as mercenaries, or giving them control of some land inside the empire with the task of defending the frontier. There was one dynasty of Frankish kings, the Salian Franks or the Salians, that used this new state in the 5th century as a base that they expanded to the north of what is now France, and eventually in the 6th century to most of Gaul of modern France on the map under a king called Clovis. Clovis converted to Christianity, which, apart from religious considerations, also made sense politically, because even though Christianity was not the traditional faith of the Germans, nor the only faith in Gaul, it had already spread to many regions of Gaul, including cities, and it would help him establish his legitimacy, control this new, larger kingdom. Clovis founded a dynasty called the Merovingians that became rather successful because it managed to consolidate and expand on these conquests. This is how, along the 7th and 8th centuries, the Merovingian dynasty and its Frankish kingdom, also called Francia. The name France comes from Frankish and Francia, but this state was not France yet. We'll see why. This state lasted longer than many other Germanic kingdoms, despite Germanic traditions that could have facilitated its dislocation, because the traditional law of the Salian Franks was that when a king died, his possessions were shared between his sons. So at each generation, the kingdom was at risk of fragmentation. It didn't mean the kingdom would entirely disappear into as many new states as there were heirs or sons. The kingdom remained as the family's possession, and the goal was to keep it as one. But the administration of the territory would be shared between the sons. So this was a rather tribal concept of state, of country. This state was somewhere between an autonomous entity that could survive its king, like a modern state, and a family asset, on which all heirs had rights. They could claim their share. Still, despite the various dynastic sharings between princes, the Merovingians managed to keep their kingdom more or less unified through war, diplomacy, and weddings. After its fragmentation, the kingdom was always reunified, so that by the early 8th century it appeared as the main political force in Western Europe. But the best was still to come. The tribal nature of this kingdom still existed. And one aspect of it was that beside the dynasty of the kings, the Merovingians, there were other prominent families, other dynasties with high responsibilities, especially a family that occupied the very prestigious and influent charge of majordomo, or mayor of the palace. They were the managers of the household of the Frankish king. But this position of majordomo went far beyond domestic tasks. In practice, they acted more and more as prime ministers at the head of the entire administration. Ambitious and capable, these mayors of the palace ended ousting the Merovingian kings and replacing them at the head of the kingdom. This dynasty is the one called Carolingian, and it emerged at the head of the Frankish Kingdom over 2 or 3 generations, with Charles Martel, his son Pépin the Short, and his grandson Charlemagne. 3 rulers that successively built upon the deeds of their predecessors to create this empire that Charlemagne ruled over. Charles Martel, Martel in Old French means hammer. So Charles Martel is famous in particular for a military victory against a Muslim invading force, the Battle of Tours or the Battle of Poitiers, in 732 AD. The Muslims, the Umayyad Caliphate, controlled most of Spain at the time, and from there they launched raids to the north of the Pyrenees Mountains, threatening to advance north. Historians disagree on the exact magnitude of this battle in 732, but the idea behind is that the existence of a Frankish kingdom of Francia with enough resources, armies and commanders to defend its southern frontier managed to stop or discourage the Muslim expansion at the time, establishing a frontier in the west between Christian and Muslim regions. The ambitions and talent of Charles Martel as a military commander played a role in this, and his son, Pépin le Bref, the Short, and grandson, Charlemagne, had the same drive to expand, organize, and defend their kingdom. It was the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire, so in centuries, that a state in Western Europe managed to last, expand, and emerge as a true power that could do a little more than just defend itself. So much so that this state ended up under Charlemagne being in a position to claim to be a successor to the defunct Roman Empire. So this was how the Frankish kingdom rose to dominance. But apart from its resources and ambitions, it was also helped a lot by the lack of opposition. The Muslim wave of invasions to the south had already lost most of its impulse by the mid-8th century in that region. And the Umayyads never really tried to launch an invasion of the rest of Europe. Apart from Spain, the rest of Europe, all of the neighbors of the Franks, were fragmented into small kingdoms into city-states or tribes with a tiny territory. Most of these Germanic kingdoms were very small. For example, if you look at Great Britain at the time, more precisely England was shared between several, like Wessex or Mercia. One thing Charlemagne and his court were aware of was that a larger kingdom, an empire, required a different way to rule, especially with a more robust administration. To understand people from the 7th and 8th centuries, especially these Germanic kings, we need to bear in mind that the big example, the one reference that they looked to for inspiration, was the memory of Rome. The Roman Empire appeared as an example of success, efficiency, prosperity that had been lost, but could still be used as a model, all the more that it had not completely disappeared. At the same time, Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, survived in the East. It was still a great power, and it had embassies across Europe. So, from his capital in Aachen, Charlemagne supervised the creation of an administration with envoys called the missi dominici, the envoys of the master, the royal envoys, to enforce laws and oversee the local nobles that ruled in the name of Charlemagne. This kind of centralized administration went against the very decentralized systems that prevailed until then. And it also turned out to be a short-lived experience, because after the empire of Charlemagne disappeared, disaggregated, after his death, Western Europe took a turn towards feudality and its extreme decentralization. It would take centuries before feudal kingdoms reappeared and began to centralize again, advancing towards the creation of modern states by reducing the reach of the feudal system. So Charlemagne's empire was somewhere in between a feudal kingdom and a reminder of the ancient Roman organization, an attempt to revive it. When we think about it, the Romans invented the modern way of looking at a state. That is to say, an entity with precise frontiers drawn on maps, an administration that covers it entirely, and the same law applying within it. There can be varying degrees of autonomy in regions or in states that are part of a federation, a larger federation. But even in a federation, there is a central government that takes decisions affecting the entire country. In foreign policy, economy and finance, the military and so on. And there are external frontiers that mark an inside and an outside. That type of state dominates the world today. We don't really imagine a different way of existing as a country. But it was not always the case. This model did not appear spontaneously. Tribal federations that often lived as nomads or feudal kingdoms had different representations of what they were. They didn't have a central government with a capacity to act on the entire territory. They didn't speak with a single voice. They didn't have precise frontiers sometimes, having more zones of influence that remained moving and imprecise, like a halo. So Charlemagne's empire mixed these elements of centralization, inspired by Rome, and the seeds of what would become the feudal system, with nobles ruling on their territory and pledging allegiance to a sovereign, and under them lesser nobles, lesser lords, all the way down in a pyramid-like kind of society. We are going to speak about the figure of Charlemagne, more specifically. But first, why the choice of Aachen as a capital? And why this spectacular chapel inside a new palace? Aachen was not really a capital in the modern sense. That is to say, a city chosen to be the fixed seat of government. The court of the Frankish kings were always itinerant, but Aachen became Charlemagne's preferred residence, especially in his later years. And so, de facto, it worked as a capital. It had the best palace, or this is where embassies went. So why the choice of this city, which was not particularly important until then? First, because it was central. In an empire that now stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to Central Europe, and from the North Sea to Italy, Aachen was relatively central. Central, but at the same time within this heart of the Frankish lands, this core of the Merovingian Kingdom, that is to say, northern France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and part of Western Germany. At the same time, it was not too far from the frontier with the Saxons that had turned out to be Charlemagne's arch-enemies along his reign. Chosen enemies, really. Because he was on the offensive in what is called the Saxon Wars. What was it? The Saxons in Germany were a confederation of Germanic tribes in northwestern Germany, in what corresponds nowadays to the Länder of Lower Saxony, Westphalia, and parts of Saxony-Anhalt. Charlemagne launched an invasion of their territory in 772. At the time, he was just 24. He was born in 748. And he did it for three main reasons. One, to expand, because at this point all of France and the Benelux was well controlled. So expanding eastward made sense. Two, for religious reasons. Charlemagne was a devout Catholic, and the Saxons were fiercely attached to their pagan beliefs. Crushing this resistance to Christianity seemed like the best way to continue the Christianization of Europe, of which Charlemagne wanted to be a champion. Actually, it is believed that one of the factors, among others of course, that could have triggered the start of Viking raids coming from the north, from Scandinavia, raids that would start soon after, could have been the perception by the Old Norse that they were threatened by these Christians to their south. As the Christians, especially Charlemagne, were aggressively targeting the pagans, and the Norse were a branch of Germanic pagan peoples. But this is another story. So this religious factor should not be underestimated. The Saxons would be forcibly converted. And third, it was a way of securing the frontier. The Franks had successively subjugated all their neighbors, except the Saxons, who lived near the Frankish heartland. Invading them was a way of pushing the frontier further. So the initial attack started in 772, But there were several campaigns over more than 30 years because the Saxons resisted and remained hard to control even after their defeats. They were a confederation of tribes, and there was no central power to sign peace with. So they kept revolting against Frankish occupation. Finally, only in 804, when Charlemagne was already an old man, Saxon resistance ended. But all along these 3 decades of campaigns against the Saxons, Aachen turned out to be a good spot, a good residence for Charlemagne. At the same time, near the core of his empire, but not too far from the battlefields or the revolting Saxon regions. It was a good place to monitor the situation. All of this forms the first reason for the choice of Aachen as a capital. It had a good location. A second reason to make it the capital was the Roman legacy. Aachen had Roman roots. It had once been a Roman settlement, Aquae Grani, a colony that the Romans had developed into Bath because it had natural hot springs. I told you about the importance of Rome's memory and legacy at the time. So by establishing his court there, Charlemagne was also claiming a connection to ancient Rome. It was also a good occasion to restore and use Roman infrastructure, the baths, and build a palace in a Roman-inspired style. The chapel I described at the very beginning, the Palatine Chapel, was modeled after an octagonal chapel Charlemagne had seen in Italy, in Ravenna. All of this illustrates the emperor's ambition to revive a Christian Roman Empire. A third group of reasons to choose Aachen as the capital was just the natural resources and comfort offered by this city. There were the hot springs that may have influenced this decision because according to a biographer of Charlemagne, Einhard, bathing and swimming were things the emperor liked a lot and practiced daily. But not just that. Aachen was surrounded by a fertile region, agriculturally rich, which meant it was able to support the royal court with food. These were times when long-haul trade was minimal, so one had to find a way to live from the land nearby. And finally, Aachen was well connected. It was near the Rhine River, and there were roads leading in and out of it, something necessary for the seat of an administration. So these are the reasons why Aachen became Charlemagne's de facto or unofficial capital. Unofficial because, as I told you, Frankish kings did not stay all the time in the same place. Actually, medieval kings, in general, were mobile. They would travel with their courts between their palaces and their main vassals' palaces as guests, which was not just for pleasure, it was politically important because the unity and the tranquility of their kingdoms relied on their personal allegiance bonds with lords. They could not let these bonds deteriorate. European kings really started to stay put and rule from one main location, one main palace, only in modern times, in the 16th, 17th centuries. Before that, they had itinerant courts that rarely stayed more than a few months in the same place. So, we have seen in which political context Charlemagne lived, where he came from as a king, why Aachen became the capital. But what was his life like? And who was he as a person? Physically, as for other medieval kings, we do not have a portrait, except on coins, but these are very imprecise. Contemporaries mention that he was tall for the time, and indeed there was an excavation of his tomb in the 19th century, and his remains suggest that he would have been 6 feet 2, that's 1.84 meters, a tall stature for the time. The average man of this era stood closer to 5 feet 5, 1.65 meters. He seems to have been in good health overall. He even died at 71 or 72, after a reign of more than 50 years. That was very old for the time. He probably never wore a long beard, as in many ulterior portraits, but probably just a mustache. And he had short hair, in contrast with Frankish kings of the past that wore their hair longer. This is thought to have been, once again, a way of becoming more Roman. Shaving, short hair, this is more Roman than Germanic. Testimonies described him as energetic and very active, charismatic too, and also very pious. More often than not, when we look at history, politics and strategy play a big role in decisions that are presented as inspired by faith or religion. In his case, it is true that choosing to become a champion of Catholicism was advantageous. Advantageous because he could use Christianity to keep his empire together. As a factor of unity, he could use it to justify invasions or to get legitimacy from the popes. But it seems it was also something deeply sincere in Charlemagne's case. All his life he protected the papacy in Rome, even though the popes were independent from his empire. And he was crowned in 800 by the pope of the time, Leo III. His empire as an unified state disappeared later, obviously, but because of this crowning and the legacy left by Charlemagne, he is considered the first one, the forerunner to the long line of Holy Roman Emperors. The Holy Roman Empire, having different frontiers than his empire, but keeping alive this legacy or the dream of recreating a Christian Roman Empire. Even though the Holy Roman Empire evolved into a very loose confederation over time, it ended only 1,000 years later, in the 19th century, when Napoleon abolished it officially. Now the kind of empire Charlemagne ruled over was one that would have looked very underpopulated and very rural to us. As I told you before, the European world was one of villages, towns at most, and this capital probably had a population of a few thousand only, maybe 10,000 at most, when the court was present and an army was stationed in the capital. The rest of the time, historians made estimates between 1,000 to 5,000 people. That is to say, if we look at it objectively, based on data, on numbers, there was no way the empire of Charlemagne or its capital could rival what Rome had been. A city of 5,000 at the time of the Roman Empire was not very important. This is where the comparison with ancient Rome ends. There was this dream of restarting an empire, but in comparison with Constantinople or Muslim cities like Damas or Baghdad, Aachen looked very small and provincial. In total, historians estimate that Charlemagne had 10 to 20 million subjects, a more respectable number. That probably represented a good half of European population at the time. Half of his subjects were in Francia, that is to say, the Frankish heartland, with northern France, the Benelux, and parts of Germany, and the rest in Saxony, northern Italy, and other frontier territories like Bavaria or a little march in Spain. As I told you in the story about Bologna recently, Bologna also being a march after Charlemagne conquered northern Italy at the expense of the Lombards. A march was a frontier territory. In feudal times, a marquess would be put in charge of a march and a count of a county, which were territories generally farther away from the frontier. Obviously, after that, with the passing of time, counties could end up near a frontier or marches comfortably away from them. But that was the origin of the term. These 10 to 20 million subjects compare with an estimate of around 60 million for the entire Roman Empire at its peak. So that remains a respectable figure. But it sounds awkward to us to have a capital of 5 to 10,000 people for a state of 15 or 20 million subjects. And this reflects that in Europe of the High Middle Ages, in Charlemagne's empire, urban areas had almost vanished. It was an almost exclusively agrarian world, based for most people on a survival economy that did not generate much surpluses to support cities or other classes of people, like scholars or traders. Charlemagne tried to impulse a few reforms in favor of education, and he tried to help abbeys that were at the time the centers of knowledge. But it didn't change the nature of this economy and society. So, by population, a small capital, and in the middle of it, there was this palace that looked very big and fancy for this place and time. The kind of decoration and architectural refinement that we can see 1200 years later at the Palatine Chapel existed in a world where almost all buildings were of wood, small, dark, and new stone constructions, even small ones, were exceptional. So this palace was a statement building. Out of it, the chapel survives, but it was only one of 3 main buildings forming a complex. Typically, the Franks built wooden structures, scattered around without a particular plan. This palace took the opposite route. It was inspired by Roman and Byzantine architecture. So it was planned, and with perpendicular buildings arranged around an axis. Mainly these 3 buildings that were connected by covered walkways and courtyards. There was the chapel, the part that survives today, a great hall called the Aula Regia, which means great hall, and which was the secular part of the palace, the place where political functions took place, meetings, hearings, feasts, receptions of envoys or ambassadors, councils. And the third part was the private one, the residential quarters. Of the three, the most heavily decorated was the first one, the Palatine Chapel, which was the religious, spiritual center, which, as I said, was inspired by a basilica in Ravenna, Italy, that Charlemagne had visited. It stood 100 feet high, 31 meters, an unusual height for the time, with a dome and a very regular, symmetrical layout. It was octagonal inside, but outside, the outer wall had 16 sides. The refinement was not just in the decoration and the materials, it was in the thought process and the attention to general aesthetics and proportions. The Great Hall, the Aula Regia, was less adorned, but also built in stone, with a wooden roof, and also inspired by Roman works. This time by basilicas, these large public meeting rooms that stood near Roman forums. The connotation of basilica is now religious, because large churches were later called basilicas, but in ancient Rome these buildings were not religious. So this hall was rectangular and also large for the time, at 154 by 66 feet, that's 47 by 20 meters. It had windows that allowed natural light inside. But overall, its decoration was not as rich as the chapels. And it was larger, it could accommodate hundreds. Finally, the residential quarters, separated from the rest by a large courtyard, included private chambers for Charlemagne, his family, and possibly guests. We know less about this part of the palace, but it is believed the residential quarters comprised a series of smaller stone and timber buildings. They were not as grand as the rest. They were connected to the hot springs and probably included a bathroom or pool area. The level of comfort was certainly rather basic, in accordance with Frankish customs, and here again, this is a part that feels far from Roman opulence. There were just wooden beds and tables, and fur coverings, no precious fabrics like velvet or silk, nor fancy furniture like Roman emperors or prominent people in Rome used to have. Apart from these three main components of the complex, there were a few more buildings, stables, barracks, workshops, housing for servants, artisans and soldiers. Artisans because at a time when there was barely any trade, or places to buy things, which is another characteristic of early medieval courts or residences that would progressively recede as medieval Europe re-urbanized and revived trade between cities and the countryside. It is estimated the complex had 200 to 500 residents when the court was present. It stood on a hill at the center of Aachen and occupied about 20 hectares, that is about 50 acres. As years passed, especially after his crowning in 800 as emperor, Charlemagne spent more and more time in this palace. He really lived there. And this is where he finally died, in 814, aged 71 or 72, after arguably the most successful reign Western Europe had seen since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. He had had time to establish embassies with faraway powers, like Byzantium, but also the Abbasid Caliph, Harun al-Rashid, in Baghdad. there are so many seeds that can be seen for the future of Europe and Christendom in the rise of this Carolingian Empire. The recreation of a powerful state, the recreation of a more robust administration, the resumption of diplomacy with the rest of the world, the affirmation of a Christian identity, including aggressively so, to convert the pagans and expand Christendom. In various countries, Charlemagne is viewed as a founding figure. Actually, he has sometimes been called the father of Europe. Why a founding figure? Because along the century, numerous royal families traced their origin back to him, which was not always very credible, but they did. Second, because he remained as a reference during the entire Middle Ages, a model of sovereign, the creator of the Holy Roman Empire, very important in the politics of Germany, Austria, Bohemia, the Netherlands, northern Italy. And third, because the Frankish Kingdom, after him, ended being divided into East and West Francia. West Francia became a precursor state of France, and East Francia of Germany. Now, precursor needs to be taken with a grain of salt, because the road to the emergence of these two countries in the following centuries would not be straightforward at all, and nothing was determined once and for all in the 9th century. But what can be said is that without Charlemagne's empire, these two countries may not have existed or may have been very different politically or culturally. For these reasons, when the European Community, the precursor to the European Union, was founded, the figure of Charlemagne was invoked immediately. Because for the founding members of this political community, his empire had covered all or part of their territory: Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And he was a figure of unity. There could be many objections to it. There are always some when historical figures are used as symbols in the present. This is always more about pushing a narrative than looking for the truth. But the legacy of Charlemagne lives on in these symbols. Even though, short term after his death, it didn't last much longer. You remember what I said earlier about the succession laws of the Salian Franks, the sons sharing the kingdoms. These rules were still in force. The division of Charlemagne's empire did not happen immediately when he died, because he only had one surviving legitimate son, Louis the Pious. Louis's reign was far from being as successful as his father's. That's another story, but his lands ended up torn by civil war between his sons. He was even temporarily deposed in 833, and he died in 840, 26 years after Charlemagne. And when he died, the sharing was done between three sons. The empire was cut in three and never reunified. Of the three sons, Charles the Bold, became king of West Francia, that is to say, Proto-France. Louis the German, king of East Francia, corresponding roughly to West Germany, and Lothair, king of Middle Francia, a long strip of land going from the Netherlands to Italy, a position that looked very uncomfortable, precarious, and indeed this kingdom of Middle Francia was short-lived. The Frankish Kingdom, as it had existed under the first Carolingians, would never reappear. And so in a few decades, Charlemagne's legacy of conquests and state building was lost, at least lost to his successors. Remained his symbolic, political, religious, cultural legacies that make him a towering figure in the history of the Middle Ages and Western Europe. This is what this chapel, that still stands 1200 years later in the city center of Aachen in Germany, still represents. We have reached the end of our story for tonight. You may now let go and fall asleep, or pick another story from my library. I'll be back soon with another one, and in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.